In this full, complete crash course on CSS, we cover everything from the very beginning and fundamentals of CSS all the way through some advanced selectors. Now this video I uploaded quite some time ago to my channel. It's a little bit old, the recording, but I had it uploaded in small little 5-minute video chunks, and it's a little bit difficult to follow the entire series. So I've compiled all of those down into one big video that's about, I think, 2.5 hours in length. Check down in the description because I'll put little jump links in the video description to jump you to specific sections if you're interested in learning about a specific topic. Also, at the end of this video, I'll give you a few tips and tricks on where to go where this video ends off. So don't forget to subscribe and like and share this content, and we will see you in the next one. All right, and welcome to another series here. This is the CSS Essentials series, where we're going to introduce CSS and the syntax and cover all the basics of properties and selectors. I want to quickly show you before we get started how you can view some CSS on a website. So I've got up here just the website designcourse.net site pulled up. And if you right click and say show page source and you navigate, usually the CSS files are included in the top of the page. And again, we're going to get to all this in a second. I'll just select the CSS sheet here and you can see that the CSS is attached to the page via this external file. So I'm scrolling down here through all of the CSS for this particular page, and the CSS is responsible for the layout. The structure is responsible, or HTML is responsible for the structure. So I want to show you what this page looks like when I turn off style sheets. Now I'm in Safari, and Safari has a develop bar up here. This menu bar will only show up in Safari if you go to Safari Preferences, head over to the Advanced tab and select this option, Show Develop Bar. Once you have that develop bar, there's all sorts of goodies tucked away in here for web design. Now I'm just going to come down to the Disable Style. So basically what this is going to do is turn off my style sheet. And you can see what this web page looks like without a CSS style sheet applied. It's just basic old HTML, some lists, bulleted items, headings, a few graphics, a few bitmaps, and that's pretty much it. This is just the raw source code. And then if I turn back on the style, you can really see exactly the power of CSS, how that introduces all of the stylistic aspects of the web page. So let's go ahead and get started. In this video tutorial, we're going to be covering the syntax of CSS. We're going to look at how it differs from HTML, although they both share very similar terminology. So this slide is just going to introduce us into the basic syntax here. This, what you see on screen, is an entire CSS rule. So let's walk through it step by step. This first portion here is what is called the selector. And the selector is responsible for targeting a specific element on your HTML page. In this case, the name of the selector would be a tag-based selector, and it's a header 1. So this would be a header 1 selector. The next two pieces here you'll see are what I call curly braces, and they simply define the declaration set. The next piece here is what we call the property. Notice how in CSS, the property is followed by a semicolon. Following the property, we have the value, and notice how the value is followed by a semicolon. I think I said the property backwards. The property is followed by a colon, and the value by a semicolon. Make sure you understand the distinction there. And the entire property and value set together is what we call a CSS declaration. You can see here this H1 CSS rule has two separate declarations. CSS rules can have one declaration, they can have 15 declarations, and we usually put each one on its own line. And then the entire thing altogether is what we call a CSS rule. So just like in HTML, where we tabbed over one space for a child tag, we do the same thing in CSS. Inside of the CSS rule, between the two curly braces, we'll tab over one tab space to kind of keep those all formatted, and it helps us to easily distinguish between the selector and the different declarations inside of a CSS tag. On this next slide, we're going to look at the different types of syntax for the actual declarations themselves, as they can vary between longhand and shorthand. Now you can see here on the left, this rule for the header 1 tag is showing the what we call longhand declaration. So this header 1 has a property of padding-top and a value of 5 pixels. Property of padding-right, padding-bottom, padding-left. You can see that each one of these are separated. However, there's an easier way to write this in CSS as opposed to writing every single one of the padding options. We can switch over to one of these 3 shorthand variants on the right-hand side. So you can see this first rule up here just says padding, and the first value is the top, the second value is the right, the third value is the bottom, and the fourth value is the left. So you can see this is much more succinct and compact than writing them all out by hand this way. So this is a shorthand variant for the padding property in CSS. Here's another variant of that, even shorter. So this just says padding, and the first value, if there's only 2 values in the padding property, the first one refers to the top and bottom padding, and the second one refers to the left and right. And if we just have 1 value in the padding declaration, that just means that 10 pixels are applied to all sides, so top, right, bottom, and left. So you can see with CSS, there's several different ways to do these declarations, and you'll kind of learn as you learn the different properties of CSS which properties do have shorthand variants and which properties don't. All right, we're going to look at what we call the cascading order of CSS and also introduce the available spots within an HTML document that you're allowed to add CSS. So let's take a look at what we call the cascading order. Now, in a typical CSS manner, you're allowed to add CSS to a HTML document in one of 3 spots. The first being external. External means that it's a completely separate file and that an external style sheet ends with the .css file extension. So just like our HTML pages end in .html, I would create a new file and give that a .css extension. Again, the file extension is just CSS, but it's just plain text. So you're able to edit and create CSS files in any program that can create text. The second option here is called the on-page CSS, and we have to use the HTML style tags, and then we can write CSS directly inside of the style tags. Those are typically done inside of the head section of the website, so up in that metadata section. The third is called inline styles, and inline style sheets are added directly to the individual tags on an HTML page via the HTML attribute style. And it's a little bit difficult to maybe understand these right now, so we're going to look at a quick overview of each of these different methods following this slide. Now, the important thing to know here is what we call, or at least what I refer to as the cascading order of CSS. The cascading order states that inline CSS overrides on-page CSS, which in turn overrides external CSS. So in other words, inline trumps on-page and on-page trumps external. Now this is in the case that you have 2 CSS rules which conflict. So for example, let's say that I have an inline CSS rule that's turning the color of my paragraph red. And I also happen to have an external CSS rule which says that the color of the paragraph should be blue. So the question is, we have a conflict, who's going to win out? Which of these are going to actually override the other one? And according to cascading order, inline would trump, so the paragraph would be red. It does get quite a bit more complicated than that when we start talking about the idea of specificity, but we'll get to that in a later video tutorial. All right, in this video, we're going to cover each of those 3 methods we just looked at in the previous slide, the external, the on-page, and the inline CSS. And we'll get started with external CSS first. Now I have here created a HTML document. Mine's just called css.html. And I've also created a document called styles.css. So you'll need to create each one of these documents. Just say file new in whatever program you're working with and just call these documents and save them both. And let's go ahead and get started here. So inside of this page, we'll start out with the external CSS first. Now, in order to work with an external style sheet, you obviously have to have it created first, and then we can link it to this HTML page. So the tag is called link, and then it's going to be first attribute inside of the link tag is what we call rel, and it's rel equals, and we'll set this equal to style sheet. The next attribute inside of this tag is what we call type, and we'll set this equal to text/CSS. And the last one is called href, and we'll set this equal to styles.css. And just like the anchor and image tags, inside of the href, this is going to be a relative path. So if your style sheet is located in a different location than wherever your HTML file is located, you'll have to either move forward or backward in your directory structure. And the last attribute here is called media, and we'll set this to all. All right, once we have this portion set up, this should tell this HTML document that we want to use this specific style sheet, whatever you have set right here, to be responsible for all the styling of our web page. And so let's go ahead and give it a try to see if it's working. Now I'm just going to set a simple header 1 tag here on the page in my HTML. So I'll say h1. And once I've created this tag, I'll save my HTML sheet. You need to make sure you save. And I'm going to come over here to my styles.css sheet and create my first CSS rule. So again, I want to target that h1. So my selector is going to be h1. So I'll do that, open my curly and close my curly brace. And then I'll do my first declaration. So I'm just going to simply say color, red. So what this should do is it should turn the header 1 red. So I'm going to save my CSS sheet, make sure my HTML sheet is saved as well. Then let's go ahead and open up those files inside of a web browser so that we can see if we have those created. So I'll open up my site, which is where I've saved those two. There's my style sheet. And here we have the CSS page. So I'll open up my CSS page in the web browser, and you can see it is in fact red. So I know that CSS sheet is working. If your selector doesn't turn red, then you know you have something wrong and you need to go double check and make sure you have all those values input correctly. All right, let's look at the second method. The second method is the on-page CSS, and that's typically done, as I mentioned, inside of the head tags. So right below this link tag, I'm going to create 2 tags which are called style tags, and the type is going to be text/CSS as well. So I'll open the style tag and I'll close the style tag. And then inside of these 2 tags, I can just simply write plain CSS. So I'll do a selector again for my header 1 tag, open and close that curly brace, and I'm going to say color blue. Now here's where we get into that idea of cascading order. Now if you'll remember back from the slide, the on-page CSS overrides the external CSS as long as this is below wherever you link to your external style sheet. So in other words, my external style sheet is turning this header 1 red. My head section disagrees and it wants to turn it blue. So which one is going to win out? Let's save and refresh. And you can see it does in fact turn blue because this is trumping it. And in this specific case, because it's created below this link. All right, the last method of adding CSS is what we call inline style sheet. And that goes directly on the tag itself down inside of the HTML. So to do that, I come down to the header 1 tag and I add this via the HTML attribute style equals. And inside of the quotation marks, I simply put CSS declarations. So I can say color, green, like so, and then semicolon. So now we have 3 separate things for the header 1 tag. They're all telling it to be a different color. Let's see who wins. Let's save. Make sure you save. Come back to your browser and refresh. You can see this time it does in fact turn green because inline style trumps the head and the external style sheet. So that's a quick intro of each one of these 3 types of style sheets and how you can add them in the specific spots. I would recommend when you start out, avoid using head section or on-page CSS, and also avoid using inline CSS. Try to focus on just using external style sheets when you're starting out, as it will save you a lot of headache in the long run. All right, in this video, we're going to be looking at many of the properties that go along with CSS, and in specific, the text and font properties. So I'm going to switch back here to the page we've been working on, and I'm going to delete all of this code for the head section CSS, and I'm also going to delete this inline CSS rule, as I just want to work with my external style sheet for now. I'm going to leave my header 1 tag intact just like we had it, and I'll be doing the bulk of the work inside of this style sheet. So just remember that this header 1 is in fact right here, and all the work we're going to be doing is for this header 1 selector. So some of the font properties that are available inside of CSS, we've already looked at color. You can do a certain number of color names like red, green, blue, orange. There is a defined set. Typically, instead of using color names, you would actually use hexadecimal values or RGB values. So hexadecimal color for red is $FF0000. This is hexadecimal for red. And if we were going to use RGBA or RGB, we would say RGB, and then we would say 255 colon 0, comma 0. And this means 255 in the red channel, 0 in the green, 0 in the blue, which would turn this red as well. So either RGB or hex is supported in CSS, and you'll almost always see them in one of those two formats. I'm just going to stick to red for now because it's a little bit easier to see the color name and associate that with a color in the HTML. So color is the first property we've looked at. Now let's look at another one here. I'll just hit return and I'm going to do a new declaration. And this one's going to control the actual font face. And this one is font-family, colon. And I'll just set this to Arial for right now. And I'm going to save and come back and refresh. And you can see that that did in fact change the heading of the font to Arial. Now one thing to be aware of with HTML fonts is I can't put any font name I have inside of here and expect it to work. The font names you list inside of your font family categories will only work if the user has that font on their system installed. So there's maybe 10 or 15 fonts that are known as web-safe fonts, which are fonts that are essentially installed on all computers, regardless of the operating system or how old they are. If you do want to use custom typography, you'll have to move into what's known as CSS3 font embedding, which we'll look at in much later CSS video tutorials. All right, now we have the font family declared. Let's look at a couple more of the font properties. One of them being the size. I can say font-size, and I'll just set this to maybe 36 points to illustrate how this changes. Let's come back and save and refresh. And you can see that that increases the size of that heading to 36 points. Let's do a couple more here. Font-style is another property. And this enables us to do italicized fonts. So I can say font-style/italic. Let's save and refresh this. You can see, in fact, that does make this font italicized. Another one of these properties is font-weight. And I can set this to bold. Now, by default, the header 1 tag is already bold. So if I was to save and refresh this, you can notice there's no change because it's already bolded. Font-weight is how I can control that. Property here is what we call font-variant, and I can set this to a few different values, one of those being small caps. Let's save and refresh. And small caps makes everything a capital letter, and the very first letter is an uppercase capital letter. So that's what small caps does. One of the font properties is the height of the line itself, and that is declared via line-height. And I can set this equal to, let's just do something quite large. Let's say 100 pixels. And I'll save this and come back and refresh. And you'll notice it shifts a little bit, but when I highlight the text, now the entire line is 100 pixels tall. So that's essentially the line height property. Another property that isn't necessarily related to the font, but the actual text, is what we call word-spacing. And I'm going to set this equal to 50 pixels. And this is going to be the space in between each word. So if I refresh, you can see here there's a 50 pixel space in between each of the words. So I'm going to set this back to 10 pixels to make it much smaller. And just like I can space out the words, I can also do letter-spacing. And I'll set this equal to, let's maybe say 20 pixels, save and refresh. And that's the space in between each of the individual letters. All right, I'm going to jump back to the CSS sheet and let's look at a couple more of these properties. I'm going to set this back to 5 pixels and I'll set this to 5 pixels as well, just so that paragraph isn't so goofy, or the header one rather. Now the next set of properties are also going to affect the text. The first being text-align. And this is how I can align a paragraph of text. I'll just set this equal to right for now and save and refresh. And you can see that that aligns the entire header one to the right side of its element. Possible values here would be right, center, left. You can also do justified text through CSS. Another property here is text-decoration, and I can set this to underline. So let's save and refresh here, and that just underlines the text. I can do overlines, I can do strike through, and many other text decoration options. You just look up text decoration on the W3C. I guess I'll mention all of these different properties have multiple values that can go inside of each one. So to find out exactly what you can and can't do for text decoration, for example, you'd have to look up on the W3C's resource to see an exhaustive list of all of those different properties. All right, another one of the properties is what's called text-indent. So we'll see text-indent, and we can set this equal to a value. I'll just say 50 pixels. And in order to see this work, I need to set the text alignment back to left. So we'll save that and refresh here. And you can see that just adds simply a 50 pixel indentation for the text. Let's just add a few more properties here. Another one is the text-shadow. Now this is a CSS3 property, so it will only work in the latest versions of the popular browsers. Just to show you the syntax, it's I'll just say 2 pixels, 2 pixels, 2 pixels, green. And we'll save and refresh. And this kind of adds a little bit of a drop shadow behind your text. Now these values are horizontal and vertical offset, the amount of blur, and the color of the shadow. So if I set this blur value to something like 15 and save and refresh, you can see that blurs that text out quite a bit more. All right, another property of the text is what we call a text-transform. And I can set this equal to lowercase and save and refresh. And you can see now all these are lowercase. Now the problem here, these are actually capitalized letter. That's because if you'll recall earlier, I had font-variant small caps. So if I was to delete this rule, then that rule should work. Now this is a good opportunity to show you how to do a CSS comment. We learned how to do HTML comments before. CSS comments are a little bit different. I can write notes to myself in a CSS sheet by doing a slash, then a star, and note goes here, and then a star and a slash. And again, this won't actually be computed as CSS. This is just a simple note to myself. So oftentimes people, in order to test things in their CSS sheet, I can just come up to this rule and I can do a star slash, and then come to the end and do a just the opposite, or a slash star star slash. You can see that just essentially invalidates that line. So now when I save and refresh over here, it is in fact all in lowercase. And I can change this to uppercase, save and refresh. Now everything is in uppercase. So you do have a few options inside of this text transform property as well. Now there's just a couple of more things I want to mention here with the font properties for CSS. You can see there's quite a few of these properties for fonts and text, and it does get quite a bit lengthy at times. And there is a shorthand variant of some of these properties. So I want to show you how to do the CSS shorthand for some of the font properties. Now before we get into that, I want to mention this font family property. Now it does say font family because this is supposed to take an entire series of fonts. So I could say something like Arial, and maybe Georgia, and Verdana, and then maybe sans-serif. Now what this means is it's first going to try the font Arial. If the user doesn't have that font installed, it moves on to Georgia. If they don't have that one, it moves on to Verdana. If they don't have that one, lastly, it says give me any sans-serif font to display, and I will use that. So this font family declaration will have a list of fonts that it tries to use before it finally gives up and just uses any old font that the user has installed, which is a sans-serif font. To demonstrate the shorthand property of the font, I'm going to remove all of this CSS here so that we can just have our font property. So I'll delete everything inside of here, and a lot of those can be rolled into a single font declaration. So I just call font. Now the order of these properties does matter. The order is font-style is the first one, comma, font-variant, and then we have font-weight, then we have font-size, we have line-height, and then finally we actually have the font-family. So all of these commas separate each one of those individual properties, and they do have to be specified in this order. It's also worth noting that all of these properties are exceptional except for font size and font family. Those are required if you do the font property this way. You have to have size and font family. The rest are optional properties. So let's do a complete, I'm going to delete all this and we'll just write out a simple rule to kind of illustrate how this works. So we'll start off and we're going to call the font property. Now if you remember the order there, the first one is the font style. So I'll just call this italic. And we're going to separate this with a space here. And the second one is the font variant. So I can say small caps. The third style here, or the third option rather, is the font weight. I can call this bold. And the next option here is the font size. And I'll just call this one 36 pixels slash 10 pixels. This is the font size, and then that slash, and then this is actually the font, the line height of the font. And then lastly, we have our font family. So I can say Arial, comma, Georgia sans dash serif, followed by the semicolon. So this is an entire font declaration all on one line. I can save this and let's come back and refresh. And you can see that is being applied there. All of those different properties from left to right. And that's how you can do the shorthand version of a CSS font. The last thing I want to note here is when you're declaring these font families, if you happen to have a two-word font, so meaning a font family that's not just a single word, you do need to enclose that inside of quotation marks. For example, instead of Arial, if I had, let's say, Times New Roman, because this is 3 words, that does need to go inside of quotation marks. So anytime you have a multi-word font name, you do need to enclose that there. And that should do it for all of the font properties. That was quite a bit there, but hopefully you learned a little bit in that series. All right, in this video tutorial, we're going to be covering some of the background properties and color and border properties of elements in CSS. And these relate to block level elements, and they kind of relate also to the CSS box model that we looked at throughout the HTML series. Now, in order to set this up, I actually want to switch out my HTML. Instead of having a header 1 tag, I'm going to switch this to a div tag, which is a division tag. I want to switch that out because the header 1 tag has quite a bit of default CSS being applied to it. It's large, it's bold, and so I want to kind of eliminate those things and just switch this to a div tag. So if I save and come back and refresh my browser here, you can see I just have this little default div. You actually can't even see it, and the text is just the normal size. Now I also need to come to my CSS file and change my selector. I can no longer select the header 1 because it does not exist, so I need to switch this to the div. And I'll delete all these font properties as we're going to be working with the border and background properties in this series. So let's do a quick test to make sure this is still working. I'm just going to change the color to red and save and refresh. And you can see, in fact, that color does change red. So we're good to go. Now I'm going to remove that property. I just wanted to make sure that we were still linked up. And let's start off with some of these border and background colors. Now the very first thing we're going to look at is what's called background. So if I say background dash color, I can set this equal to a hexadecimal value. And I'll just do a color for now. Let's just say orange. And we'll save and come back here and refresh. And now you can see how that element is completely orange. And this helps illustrate the box, or rather the block nature of the division tag. You can see that it's a block tag because it occupies this entire line, whereas before we actually couldn't see that, but now with the background color in place, we can see that. All right, next let's go ahead and add a few more properties to this. So now that we have that background color in place, we can see it. Let's add in a border. So what we want to do is we want to say border, and I'll just say 5 pixels, solid green. And we'll save that and come back here and refresh our browser. And I'm going to zoom in here a little bit, but you can see I do have that 5 pixel green border. And this will help us illustrate the box model again. So I'm going to say padding, and I'll set that equal to 10 pixels. Remember, the padding is the space in between the text and the border. So when I refresh here, that creates a 15 pixel space all the way around. And let's go ahead and add some margin. Let's say 20 pixels. Margin is the space outside. So if I refresh here, I have a 20 pixel space outside of the box. So you can kind of see some of those properties now come into play. Now this border property I did was CSS shorthand. This first value is the size, the second value is the style, and the third value is the color. So I could actually break this up into multiple properties, but it gets quite a bit messy, as I'll illustrate now. So I'm going to delete this border rule, and I could say border dash top 5 pixels solid green, and I'm just going to copy and paste this 4 times down, and I'll change this one to right, I'll change this one to bottom, and I'll change this one to left, just to illustrate how you can have each of these be different. The border can be different for each side. So I'll say green, red, purple, and pink. We'll save and refresh. And you can see each of those borders does give a different color. And something you can see unique here is that borders, they split the border right down the middle. Instead of just squaring off, they actually split the border. Now the middle property here, the style, is also different. I can have one's called grooved. So let's save and refresh that. That actually doesn't work inside of here. Let's switch it to dashed. Dashed is an option. This will give it kind of a dashed line. If I was to zoom back out smaller here, let's actually set that to the bottom border. It might be a little bit easier to see there. Dashed, and save and refresh. You can see that's kind of a dashed cutout line. But there's several options here for the style. And then the size, obviously 5, 10. I can set this weight. I'll set this one to 15 and refresh. And now that's a 15 pixel border. So that kind of illustrates how you can change each of the borders independently from one another. And it gets a little bit more complicated if we were to do these without the shorthand method. So without shorthand, I would have to say border dash color, and I would set that equal to 5 pixels. Or I would say border dash color dash top. Actually, I think it might be border dash top dash color, and set that to 5 pixels. And let's just assume I'm working with this one right here. I would have to say border dash top dash style and set that to solid, and border dash top dash color and set that to green. So again, this is the longhand version, where this line would be the shorthand version. You can see how shorthand is quite a bit easier to work with, but that's essentially how we can use all these different border properties to manipulate the lines on our borders. So let's go ahead and delete all of this. It got a little bit messy, and I'm just going to take this back to a single line here, and I'll just say border 5 pixels solid blue. Save and refresh there so we can just have a nice easy border to work with, and I'll zoom back in there. All right, so that's the border property. We have a padding and margin on that. We have a background color. Now let's look at a few of the additional background options that I can do. Not only can I add color to a background, but I can also add images. So in order to get the images set up, we need to make sure we have our images in our folder. So let's go back to our desktop here and make sure we have our site set up. Now I've got these two files, my CSS and my style sheet, inside of this My Site folder. And if I open up my resources, I actually have an images folder here with this flower.jpg. So we're going to be using this image reference. So we need to remember our file paths from the previous HTML Essentials series. And to do this one, it's called the background-image. And then we say URL. And then inside of these quotation marks is the path to the image file. So just like we would do in HTML, except this is via CSS. So I'm currently working on my CSS sheet, so I need to first go into _resources. So _resources / Once I'm inside of here, I need to further dive down into the images folder. So we say images slash, and then once I'm in the images folder, I just simply reference the file name I'm after, which in my case is flower.jpg. You'll need to pull out your own image. And that should work. Let's save and come back and refresh now. And everything went black here. So that tells me that either the image is very large or I can only see the very top. And you'll see here that actually this image just is black at the top. So it did in fact load the image, but I'm only seeing the very topmost part. Now to see the entire image, I need to increase the size of my div. So I can simply say height equals, and I'll just make it not equals, colon 600 pixels. And let's say width 500 pixels. Let's save and refresh this. And now you can in fact see that image. And I'm going to zoom out here a little bit to illustrate something else that's happening. You can see that this image is doing what we call tile. It's tiling from left to right and it's tiling from top to bottom. In other words, it's repeating everywhere. If I was to make this box even bigger, let's maybe go 900 by 900 and save and refresh. You can kind of see it even tile further. So the default behavior of background images in CSS is they tile. They go every which way. And I can manipulate this behavior with a few additional properties. So let's look at those next. The first one is what we call background-repeat. And there's a few options in here. The default repeats everywhere, but I can override that and I can say no-repeat. Spell that right. And save that and refresh. And this will only give me one image. It won't repeat. And you can see that background color is in fact still there. So the background color is behind the background image in CSS. I can set this equal to repeat x, repeat -x, and x refers to the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis. So when I refresh here, it'll refresh horizontally. I can switch it to repeat -y, and it's going to repeat along the y-axis, which is up and down. And that's how I can control the repeating nature of background images. So I'm going to set this back to no-repeat. And we'll look at this next property. Now, the position of this image is also overridable with CSS. By default, it's up at the top left-hand corner of my box. And I can move that around via the property background-position. Now, this background position is a little bit goofy in the values that it takes. So I'll just kind of quickly mention a few of them. It can either take keywords, or it can take percentages, or it can take pixels. So first I'll show you the percentages this can take, or not percentages, the values this can take with keywords. So I might want to say right space bottom. Now what this is going to do, it's going to align it to the right side and then down to the bottom. So I would expect this to appear down here in the bottom right. So let's refresh, and it does in fact appear down there. Okay, now let's switch this to right-top and save and refresh, and it appears at the top right. Let's switch this to left top. That's the default. And then we can also switch this to left bottom. And then it's down here. So the first value is whether it's on the left or right hand side, and the second value is whether it's on the top or the bottom. Now, instead of doing these, you can also use percentages. I can say 0, 0, and that is going to be top left up here. I can say 0, let's actually move it to the top right. I can say 100% and 0, and that's going to be 100% to this side and 0 down. And I can say 100%, 100%. And that's going to be 100% over this way and 100% down this way, or bottom right. And I can also say 0%, 100%, which is going to be bottom left. You don't have to use 100%. You can also say 50% and save that and refresh. And you can see that's right in the middle. So if I wanted to center this thing directly in the middle, I could say 50%, 50%, and it would be perfectly in the middle of this box. And I can also use the values, the keyword values, center, center. Save and refresh, and it'll also place it in the middle. So keywords or values Or lastly, finally, I can use pixels. So I can say something like 100 pixels, and let's just do 10 pixels. And save that and refresh. You can see that offset is always first from the left side, so it's 100% from the left and it's 10 down from the top. So I can use hard pixel values if I need to position it in a specific location, those keywords, or those percentages. The last thing I want to show you with this background is how to do this tag with CSS shorthand. So to do this all on one line, I can simplify all this code, and there's a shorthand property here I can just call background. And the first value here is going to be the color if I wanted one. I'll just do that in hexadecimal. I'll just say 00FF00. So this is RGB, so that's red, green, blue. So this is actually going to be a green color. And the next value here is the URL. So I'll just copy and paste this one as well. So I'll copy this, paste it there. The third value here is the position. So I'll set this equal to center, center. And the last value here is the repeating nature. And I'll set this equal to no-repeat. Now let's save and refresh this. And it's green, it's in the center. And you can see that I can do all of these properties on one single line with the CSS shorthand by just simply calling background. CSS3 introduces quite a few new nifty options to work with background images. In CSS2, which is what we're using here, you're only allowed to specify one image per element. So this div can only have one background image. However, with CSS3, I can specify multiple images inside of one div. So I could have 3 or 4 background images and I can layer those. You're also able to size images. With CSS3, I can take that background image and stretch it or shrink it. And I can clip the background image with CSS3. So I do have quite a few new properties, and we'll look at those in some of the more advanced CSS series later on. In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at the available units of measure in CSS. So let's take a look at a quick slide to understand the differences. Now there's 2 main categories. There's absolute units of measure, and there are relative units of measure. And the absolute units of measure are here on the left. We have pixels, points, picas, inches, centimeters, and millimeters. And over here on the right, we have percentage-based units. We have what are known as ems, EM, and we have what are known as x's, EX. Now, all of these relative units of measure over here on the right are based off of something else. The percentage, obviously, 50% is 50% of something, so that's going to be based off of a current value. The M value is always based off of the user's current font size declared in their preferences for their particular browser. The default for most browsers is a 16-point font. So if I say 1M for the font size, I'm saying essentially 100% or 1, the factor of 1 for the current font size. So essentially 1M would be a 16-point font. If I said 2Ms, I'm saying twice the value of the current font size. If I said 3Ms, I'm saying 3 times the value, etc., etc. X is essentially the line height of a font, or it's the size of the lowercase x, whereas M is the size of the capital letter M in the current font size as well. So you can kind of think of an X as almost being a half of an M, 0.5 M. And so all of those units of measure are relative. Over here on the left, these are fairly self-explanatory. A pixel is a pixel. Now you could maybe argue that the pixel is actually a relative unit of measure because pixels, I guess, technically change from screen to screen in resolution and pixel density. But for our purposes, we're going to leave them over in the absolute category. Points are 1/72nd of an inch. That comes from the printing standard with points. I'm sure you're familiar with points from Word and other softwares, 12-point font, 14-point font. Picas is just simply referred to as 12 points. And then an inch is an inch, a centimeter is a centimeter, and a millimeter is a millimeter. Those values don't ever change. They're always absolute. So we can use any of these units of measure in CSS. And I'll give you a quick example of how we can do that in our code. I'll switch back here to the previous example we've been working on, and I'm going to delete all of this code we had in here for our background image and save and come back here and make sure we're just kind of at a blank slate for our CSS. Whoops, I just closed out of there. Let's open this back up, come into our CSS sheet and refresh. Okay, so we deleted all that content, so we're back to just where we've started. Now back here in our code, I'm going to change the font size of that object. I'm going to use several different units of measure. So I'll start off and say font dash size, and let's just do a point based at first. So I'll say 18 points. And let's save and refresh. And that heading does in fact change to an 18-point font size. We can do picas, so I can say 1 PC and refresh, and that's a 12-point font. I can say 1 IN for inch and refresh, and that's an inch size. Let's do the centimeter, and then we can do the millimeter. So you can see the millimeter is obviously a very, very small font size. So those are most of the relative units. I think I got them all. Let's switch over to the absolute. These are a little bit more abstract and a little bit difficult to grasp first. So at first, I'm just going to set this font size to 100%. And essentially, this isn't going to change anything. It's just going to display at 100% of the current font size, which is set to 16 pixels by default in my browser. So that doesn't really do anything. 200% is going to double it, and et cetera, et cetera. I can do up to 600%. I can also do 25%. And you can see how those relative units of measure work. Now let's switch this over to ems. I'm going to say 1 em isn't going to change anything because that's 1, a factor of 1 of the current font size. So that's basically like saying 100%. If I switch this to 3 ems in this instance, it's kind of like saying 300%. Let's switch it over to 1x. And this is going to half it because this is half of the current font size. It's the line height, which happens to be half of 16, so 8, and et cetera, et cetera. In this video tutorial, we're going to be covering CSS selectors. And CSS selectors are a very important part of CSS. And let's take a quick look at some of the definitions of the different types of selectors. Now, here's a handful of types of CSS selectors. This list is not all-inclusive. CSS 3 includes some more advanced type of selectors. But this is the basics of the selector types. The first type here on the list is what we call an ID selector. Now, an ID selector applies to a single HTML element via ID equals ID name. And we're going to look at examples of each one of these in the next video tutorial. So don't worry about memorizing these quite yet. It'll make sense in here in just a minute. The second type is what we call a class. And it is via the period class name. And it applies to one or many HTML tags with the class equals class name attribute. Now, one of the main differences between an ID and a class, you'll notice that an ID can only be used on a single HTML element, whereas a class or a class name can be used on multiple HTML elements. And we'll look at that again in a later video as well. The third type, and probably the most simple, which we've already looked at so far, is just simply the tag name. And this applies to one or many HTML tags, and it's just referenced by their name, like a header 1 or an h1 tag. The fourth type here is what we call a compound selector. And a compound selector is made up of IDs, classes, or tag names in this big hierarchy. So the space in between each one of these CSS selectors indicates that that's another hierarchy or a child of. So this particular one, I'd like to recommend that you read these from right to left. So this would be a list item. That's a child of a unordered list. That's a child of something that has the ID of ID name. So again, that's a compound selector. A group selector is simply a group of CSS selectors that are all separated by commas. So this would be a header 1, comma, and also an ID name, comma, and then also a list item inside of a UL. So these particular rules would be applied to all 3 of these CSS selectors. And the last type here is what we call a pseudo selector. And an example of this is the hover state. Pseudo selectors are selectors that apply to states of tags. For example, when you hover the mouse over a link, if the button changes color or the text changes color, pseudo selectors would take care of that. So those are the main types of selectors. In this next video, we're going to walk through each one individually. All right, in this video tutorial, we're going to walk through all of the different types of CSS selectors and look at examples of how each of those work. Now I have set up here a basic HTML page. It's similar to the ones we worked on in our previous video tutorials. So I have this HTML file and I also have a CSS sheet. And I'll open up this HTML file inside of the web browser. Right now, this HTML file is simply made up of 2 divs, and each one of these divs has a paragraph of text. If I jump back over here to my web editor, you can see that the HTML file is just a div with a paragraph and a div with a paragraph. We're going to use this basis to illustrate how these CSS selectors work. Now the majority of the work we're going to be doing is inside of the style sheet. So I'm going to jump back over here to my style sheet. Right now it's just empty. And let's start out with the selector that we've already looked at before, which is a tag selector. Now, tag selectors are simply referenced by their name. So P is a tag-based selector, and this is going to affect the paragraph tag. So if I just come in here and say color :red semicolon, so that's the property and the value. Remember the semicolon and then, or the colon and then the semicolon at the end. Now, if I save this and jump over to my web browser and refresh, Command R on a Mac or F5 on a PC, you can see those paragraphs do in fact turn red, and both of the paragraphs are affected. So if I look back here at my HTML, the way that tag-based selectors work is it's any paragraph within this HTML page will have those CSS rules applied. So the tag-based selector is fairly easy to work with. If I want to affect the header 1, I would just say header 1. But again, this will affect all of those header 1s on a page. So the question comes, well, what if I want to have one paragraph red and the other paragraph green? How can I do that? And the easy answer to that question is through classes and IDs. So we're going to look at each of those selectors next. Now, we'll start off with the ID selector. And if you remember back to the PowerPoint slide, ID selectors have the ID equals and then ID name. So this is an HTML attribute that you add on the tag itself. And the ID name can actually be whatever you want. I could call this Andrew. I could call this blah. You just can't have spaces. So I can't say Andrew space something. That space will actually break it. They also cannot start with numericals. So you can't say 1 Andrew or 9 Andrew. You can actually terminate with a number. So I can actually say Andrew 9. But I recommend, because you can't start with them, just avoid them altogether, and then you don't have to worry about remembering that. So just do A through Z, and you can do you can do hyphens, or I can also do underscores. So those are all valid ID names. So let's take a sample here. I'm just going to call this ID equals paragraph top. This is called camel casing. I could do a dash there. So this is the top paragraph. And I'm going to copy this ID name and jump back to my CSS style sheet. And remember, in the CSS, to reference an ID, we use the pound sign. So it's pound, and then you simply type out the name of that ID that you gave your HTML tag. Open and close your curly brace. And let's say color is blue. Okay, so we'll save that. And we'll jump back here and refresh. And now nothing is actually happening here. So that tells me I have an error because this should in fact turn blue, this second paragraph or that top paragraph. So, and the error is that I have not saved it. You'll see this little circle here. I forgot to save my HTML document. So I need to save both of these. When you're working with CSS and HTML, it's often you have to remember to save the CSS and save the HTML when you make those changes. So I've just saved both. Now I'll jump back here and do Command R to refresh again. And now it does in fact turn blue. Now here's an interesting conundrum that you'll often find yourself in with CSS. I have conflicting rules here. This top rule is saying turn all paragraphs red. And now this second CSS rule is saying turn this specific ID blue. And that specific ID just so happens to be on a paragraph. So this is trying to be turned red and blue. And it in fact turned blue. And the reason why is because of what we call CSS specificity. Now, CSS specificity is kind of an advanced topic, and it's a little bit outside of the scope of this initial video tutorial. But a quick rundown of specificity is that IDs are more specific than tag-based selectors. So this will always trump a general tag-based selector because it's a more specific type of CSS selector. And you can look up online in several resources. Just type in CSS specificity and you'll get a whole bunch of resources to see exactly which types of selectors override other types of selectors. All right, now we've looked at the ID selector. Let's come down to this second paragraph and let's add a class. So I'll say class equals, I'm just going to type something else. And again, these class names are the same thing. I can make these up. They can be whatever I want. So let's come back to our style sheet here, and I'll do a new rule. Classes in CSS start with a period. So I'll say period something else, and I'll open and close the curly braces. And I'll come in here and say color yellow. So actually, let's do green so we can see it a little bit better on our screen. We'll save and come back and refresh our browser window, and I made the same mistake. I did not save my HTML page, so I need to save that. Then come back and refresh. And now you can see that second paragraph does in fact turn green. Now I have three conflicting rules. This one says turn them both red. This says turn the top one blue. This one says turn the bottom one green. And the reason why it does in fact turn green is because of that idea of specificity. Classes are also more specific than general paragraphs. That's a hard word to say. And IDs are more specific than classes. So that's kind of a general hierarchy there. That's a quick intro into the CSS selectors. And in the next video tutorial, we're going to look at the rest. In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at the grouped and the pseudo selectors in CSS, as well as the compound. Now, in order to illustrate these type of selectors, I'm going to modify the HTML a little bit and add a little bit more complexity to this. So down here in my second division tag, I'm going to add an unordered list. And in this unordered list, I'm going to add 3 list items. So I'll just quickly add this HTML here. Again, an unordered list. Order doesn't matter, so this will actually be a bulleted list. And in this last list item, I'm going to add an anchor tag, a link tag. So a href equals, I'll just put a £sign for now, and then I'll close the anchor tag right there. So let's save this HTML and come over to our browser and refresh and see what we have. So you can see I do in fact have that unordered list, 3 items, and this last list item is an anchor tag, which I can then click. It's not going to go anywhere, but that allows me to click it. Now let's jump back to our CSS, and we're going to illustrate the grouped selector first. So I'll come back here to my CSS, and I'm actually going to delete all this default code we worked with in the last video tutorial, and we'll start over from scratch. So we'll just have a default empty CSS sheet for now. And a group selector are multiple CSS selectors separated by commas. So I could do P, comma, that's for the paragraphs. I could do another one for the anchor tags, comma, and then I could do another one for, let's do for this instance, a class-based selector. Maybe we'll do class as something else. And dot something else. Then we open and close our curly, and I'll say color, let's say green. So what this means is the color green is going to be applied to this class and this tag selector and this tag selector. So all 3 of those should have this CSS applied. So we'll save here, come back and refresh. And you can see in fact that both paragraphs, that class, and that anchor tag are all turning green. So that's how a group selector works. It's just simply separated by comma. Really, this is just a shorthand way of doing this. I'll just copy these and paste this down here a couple of times. So I could have said, there we go. So anchor tag green, paragraph green, something else green. So this is a little bit redundant. So to reduce all of this work, I could have taken that back just to the group selector like this. So that's how the group selectors come in handy. All right, the next type of selector we're going to look at is the pseudo selector. Now, pseudo selectors are used for states, and to illustrate this one, I'll use the anchor tag. So I'm going to write a tag for the anchor, just the general anchor, and I'm going to say color, let's say red. And I'm going to make the font size a little bit bigger here. So I'll say font size, let's jump all the way up to 24 point. Actually, let's do something a little bigger. Let's do 32 point. And let's save and refresh and come back here and look at this. So you can see that last one is in fact red and it's got that really large font size. And then to do the pseudo selector, if you remember, there's one that's the hover and they're separated by colons. So I can say a colon hover, and this is a hover pseudo selector on the anchor tag. And I'll say color green. So what this means is when the hover state is activated, do this CSS. So in other words, when I hover my mouse over that last list item, I'll save and refresh, it does in fact turn green. And that's how you can do CSS-based rollovers for your menu items. Just to illustrate this one a little bit further, I'll come into this anchor tag and I'll just give it a background color. So I'll say background color, let's say blue. And then when I hover, we'll change the background color to, let's say, yellow. So we'll save here and refresh. So now it has a background color of blue. When I hover, the text should turn and the background color should turn. So you can see both of those elements are changing when I hover over that specific anchor tag. And that's how the pseudo selector works in CSS. There is another pseudo selector. There's actually a couple for the anchor tag. There's anchor colon hover, which we've looked at. There's visited, which designates the color of the visited. So once I've clicked on the link, by default it turns purple. If you want to change that default purple color, you can use the visited. So there's a few other pseudo selectors associated with the anchor tag besides hover. All right, the last one we're going to look at, and probably the more complex of all of these, is the compound-based selector. And this one tends to catch people when they're starting out in here. So we'll look at a few samples. Now, in order to illustrate this better, I'm going to come back to my HTML page, and let's kind of make sure we understand this structure here of our HTML. So this first div, I'm going to delete this ID on the paragraph. I'm going to delete this class on this paragraph, and I'll add an ID on this second paragraph. So I'll just call this ID equals second div, so you remember which one this is referring to. So just kind of get a good idea for how this works. There's a div tag, and there's a paragraph that's a child, and an unordered list that's a child. This first div just simply has a paragraph as a child. So let's say that I want to colorize this second paragraph, but I'm not allowed to add a CSS, or rather a class or an ID to the paragraph like we did before, but I want them to have different colors. In order to do this, we can use a compound selector. Some people call these descendant selectors, and they're really powerful. So let's jump back here to the CSS, and the way I can do this is first I would reference the ID of this div. So ID second div, space P. So let's just do this simple example first. So in here I'm going to say color red, and I'll save this and come back and refresh. And you can see that only that second paragraph is turning red, even though I have two paragraphs inside of divs. And the reason why is this descendant selector is always based on a hierarchy. So what this is saying, if you read it from right to left, it's saying any paragraphs that are a child of, that's what the space means, a child of anything with the ID of second div turn red. So if we come and look at our HTML, which one of these paragraphs, if any, are true for that? So here we have a paragraph that is a child of an ID of second div. So this is true. Up here we have a paragraph. It's a child of just a div. It isn't a child of something that has an ID. So this one would be false. So this one would not turn red. So that's kind of how that compound selector works. And you can have as many levels of the hierarchy as you want. So I could say #div space ul space li space a. So this is going to affect a very specific element. It's always the last element which is going to be targeted. So this will affect anchor tags that are a child, that's what the space means, of a list item, that is also a child of an unordered list, that is also a child of any tag with the ID of second div. So if we come to our HTML and look, do we have something that is true? And yes, we do. This anchor tag is a child of a list item. This list item in turn is a child of a UL. This UL in turn is a child of any tag, it just so happens to be a div, of the ID of second div. So this should turn that anchor tag red, and it in fact does, because of this compound-based type of selector. So again, these are a little bit tricky sometimes because you can mix and match selectors. It maybe wouldn't be common to have something like #nav space li space a dot current link or something like this. So you can actually mix and match classes, tag names, or rather IDs, tag selectors, class selectors. You can mix and match all of these different types of selectors inside of this descendant chains here. Now, one thing I want to point out here, and this will be the last thing for this tutorial, is the difference between these two types of selectors. So here I'm going to say pound, let's say ID name, space, let's just say list item. Okay. And next on here, I'm going to say div pound ID name space list item. Now these two are different selectors. So this first one says apply to the list item the CSS in here. That's a child of a div with the ID of ID name. Notice there's no space right here. Where this one says the list item that's a child of any HTML tag with the ID of ID name. So if there's no space between the tag and the ID or class, that means that this ID has to be on a div tag in order for this entire rule to be true, where this one can just be on any old tag. So make sure you understand the distinction there. A lot of times it's a little bit tricky to see because if there's a space here, that means something completely separate. This means a list item that's a child of any tag with the ID of iname that's also a child of a div. Whereas if that space is gone, this means something completely separate. So make sure you watch and see if there's a space or no space in between those, because that space indicates that there's another level of hierarchy. So those are the basics of the CSS selectors, and we're going to look at some real-world examples when we start to build in our next CSS positioning series. All right, in this video, we're going to be looking at the 3 types of CSS positioning and kind of some higher level knowledge of how these 3 types differ. Once we look at these examples, we'll jump into some code samples and see exactly how they work on a real HTML page. Let's first look at a couple of slides to define the 3 different types of CSS positioning. The first type is absolute positioning, and there's a few things you'll want to note here. All 3 of these types have a different positioning context. And with absolute positioning, the context is according to the parent element only if the parent element has a position. Also note that with absolute positioning, the element gets removed from the normal document flow. The second type is relative positioning. Its positioning context is itself, or its natural flow in the document, and this element stays in normal document flow. The third type is fixed positioning, and fixed positioning has a context of the viewport, which is a fancy name for the browser window. And this element also gets removed from the document flow, just like absolute positioning does as well. So let's look at a quick sample of each of these 3 types in these next slides. When you're using CSS positioning, you have 3 possible values for positioning, and they are top, right, bottom, and left. Now, the way this works is if you use positive values, you're going to be moving the element in. So you can see if I use a positive value for the property top, I'm actually going to be moving it down. If I use a positive value for the property bottom, meaning the bottom edge, it's actually going to move the element up. So any positive values, you can kind of think of this as the offset. It's going to kind of push in towards the box. Positive value on left will move right. A positive value on the right side will move left, and etc. If we use negative values, it's just the opposite. So if I was to say top -20, it's actually going to move up, whereas top +20 would push down. And again, left -20 would actually move it this direction to the left. Left +20 would move it this direction or to the right. So you need to remember the positive and negative values of each of these properties. Now with relative positioning, we'll take a look at this one first because it's probably the easiest to understand. Now, if you remember back, relative positioning is positioned according to itself. So if I had the following div declared in my web page, this is just a sample div here. Let's say I declare a position of relative and I say top 50 and left -50. This is a positive value, so it would move down 50 pixels from the top. This is a negative value, so it would move left 50 pixels from the left edge. So this just kind of shows how this div would actually move, assuming I used these positionings. So its previous location would have been here, but it would actually display at this location. And because this edge is outside of the browser window or the viewport, it would actually be cut off and it wouldn't be visible. You can see here the negative value pushes left and the positive value pushes down. Now in absolute positioning, remember its positioning context is according to the parent element, only if the parent element has a position. So let's just assume in this example that this blue box back here is the parent element and this brown box inside is a child tag. So the div we're working with is the brown box and it's inside of this big blue box. Now, because we're working with absolute positioning, its positioning context is the parent. So when it says bottom 50, it's not its own bottom edge, it's the parent element's bottom edge. So a positive value on bottom would actually move it up 50 pixels from the parent's bottom edge, and a positive value on right would actually move it left 50 pixels from the parent's right edge. So again, this just kind of illustrates how this box would move. If I said bottom 50, right 50, it normally would appear up here at the top left, but after applying the CSS position, it would actually appear down here 50 pixels away from the right edge and 50 pixels away from the bottom edge of the parent element. The third type and last positioning context is with fixed. Now fixed positioning always uses the browser window or the viewport as its context. So it doesn't matter what the parent tag is or the parent element, it's always going to use the viewport. So in this particular example, if you use a value of 0 pixels for bottom, that just means right on the bottom edge. So in other words, move 0 pixels away from the bottom edge, and this would move 0 pixels away from the right edge. So it would actually, we would expect this box to be right down here. So let's give this a try. And you can see how in this particular example, after applying this fixed position, this box would now draw itself in the bottom right hand corner of the browser window. Even if I resize the browser window, this box would always be in the bottom right. All right, in this video tutorial, we're going to be looking at each of the types of CSS positioning, and we will start off with relative positioning. So back here in our code, we have a simple HTML page, and the only thing that this HTML page has is a single div tag. And we're going to give this div tag an ID. So we're going to say ID equals, I'm just going to call it red box for now. And back here in my CSS, I'll create a new CSS rule for that ID. So I'm going to say pound red box, open and close the curly braces. And now all the CSS in here will only affect this specific div because of the red box ID. Now, let's just give this some dimensions so we can see it. So I'm going to say width is 400 pixels, and we'll say height is 400 pixels. And I'm going to give it a background dash color of red. So we'll save here and we'll jump back to our browser and refresh, and we can see that div lay it out there on the page. Now, to illustrate how this relative positioning works in the real HTML and CSS, let's go ahead and move this div tag. So first thing is I need to assign it a position. So I'm going to say position relative, and you're going to use positioning whenever you want to alter the default layout of a tag. So if a tag is here by default and I need to move it, then you need to use positioning. So let's say I want to move this tag over and down 200 pixels. So if I want to move it over, I'm going to use the keyword left because I want to move it from the left edge. It's always the offset. So if it's going to move right, it's going to move from its left edge. And remember, the positive values push right. So I would say left and then a positive number. So let's say left 200 pixels. So I'll save here and come back and refresh. And you can see that does in fact push this div over 200 pixels. If I would have switched that and said negative 200 pixels, it would have pushed left, and it's actually halfway off the screen and it would be invisible. So that cuts off the div because it's outside of the browser window. Now I'll switch that back to a positive number, and whoops, positive number there, and we'll, whoops, I guess I don't need even the value, just 200 pixels, and save and refresh. Now in order to move down, it's going to move from the top edge, and again, positive value would push down. So if I said top 200 pixels and save and refresh, you can see it moves down 200 pixels. And that's how relative positioning works. It's always positioned according to its natural position in the document, which normally would have been up here. So it's positioned according to itself, and it does not remove itself from the document flow. Now to illustrate document flow and kind of what that means, let's add a couple more tags to our HTML. So I'm going to delete all this positioning and come back and refresh here. And we're going to add in another div. So below this div, I'll say div ID equals, and I'll call this one blue box. And let's close off that div tag. And then let's add some CSS so we can see this div as well. So I'll come over here and I'll call this one pound blue box for the ID. And it's basically going to have the same rules. So I'll just copy and paste these inside of here. Except I want width to be maybe 600 pixels. And let's say height is 200 pixels. And of course, we'll make it blue. So let's save and refresh. Now this is just the default layout. Because divs are block level tags, they occupy the entire horizontal line here. So both of these are actually occupying this entire line and this entire line because of their block nature. And let's see exactly what happens to the divs when I move the red div. So we'll come back in here and we'll reinstate that position of relative. And we'll do the same thing. We'll just say top 200 pixels. And we'll say left 200 pixels. I'm going to save and refresh, and you'll visually be able to see exactly what happens. So when I refresh here, notice that this blue div down here didn't in fact move. The red div just moved on top of it. In fact, I'm going to back each of these values off 100 pixels so you can still see the blue div down there. So the red div just moved over on top. And that's because when you use relative positioning, the item is not removed from the document flow. In other words, as far as the blue div is concerned down here, this blue box, it still thinks that the red box is right above it in this location. It's really not aware that it's actually moved down here. So that's kind of how document flow works. Now you'll compare and contrast that with our absolute positioning, which does remove the element from the document flow. And we'll look at that in the next video. All right, in this video, we're going to be looking at absolute positioning and how that works in a CSS and HTML example. So we're going to go back to the same sheet we worked on before, except we're going to rearrange our HTML a little bit. We're going to take this blue box, and we're actually going to paste it inside of the red box. You'll recall in order to use absolute positioning, the element is positioned according to a parent tag. So we have to set up a parent and child relationship here. So red box in this instance is the parent and blue box is the child. Now let's set up some default CSS. So we'll just leave the red box alone. We'll just leave it 400 by 400 and leave it red. And this blue box, we're going to make 100 by 100 and leave this one blue. Now let's go back here and look at our HTML and refresh here, and you'll be able to see the default layout. Now the red box is the parent and the blue box is the child, and you can see that the blue box is in fact inside of the red box. Now let's switch this blue box to use absolute positioning. So let's come over here, and I'm going to take the blue box and I'll give it its positioning context. So I'll say position absolute. And in this instance, I'm going to say top 100 pixels and left 100 pixels. Now you'll recall, in order for absolute positioning to work, the parent element has to have a position. And right now the red box does not have a position. So I need to add one. And typically that's done just by saying position relative. I actually don't need to move the box at all. I just need to simply assign it a position. But as long as it has any type of position, it could be relative, absolute, or fixed, then this absolute positioning will work. But again, this is required for the parent element. Now let's go back to this blue box and save and refresh. Now top 100 and left 100. The main difference between the two of relative and absolute is with absolute positioning, the context is the parent element's edges. In other words, the red box. So when I say top 100, it's referencing the top edge of the red box, not the blue box. So when I refresh here, it's pushing down 100 pixels from the top of the red, and it's pushing left 100 pixels from the left of the red. And that's where my blue box would appear. Now if I switch these values to bottom and right, I'm going to say bottom 100 pixels and right negative 100 pixels. So again, a positive value pushes up from the bottom edge. So bottom 100, it should push up 100. And then right negative 100, negative values push out. So it should push this way from the right edge of the parent. So I would expect this box to actually pop up right around over here when I refresh. So let's refresh this page. And sure enough, it pops up over there. Now it's moving right 100 and up 100 from the bottom. So again, remember that the context of the absolute positioning is not the blue box, rather the red box's edges. So when I say bottom 100, it's the red box's bottom edge, then up 100. So that's the main difference between the absolute and relative. Now the last thing we're going to look at is the fact that absolute positioned elements do remove themselves from the document flow. And this will contrast with the last video where we show that relative positioning does not remove itself from the document flow. So in order to illustrate this, I'm going to delete this positioning here on the blue box to put it back at its default layout. I'm going to come over to my HTML and add a new div. So above this blue box, I'm just going to add another one. I'll say div ID equals, we'll just call this one green box. And we'll close that div, and let's come add some CSS so we can see this. I'm going to copy all of this content here and just paste this down here for our green box. And we'll call this one green box. And let's make this one 200 by 200, and we'll make it green. Okay, so let's save and refresh. Whoops, I haven't saved my HTML here. Oh, it looks like I forgot to capitalize that. We'll stay consistent. The camel casing, green box like that. Make sure that my CSS has that capital B, and it does. So we'll save and refresh. All right, and this is the default layout. Now the red box is the parent element, and it has two children. This green box and this red box. This is 200 by 200 and 100 by 100. And this is the default layout. I haven't modified anything. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to take this red box, and we're going to modify its position with absolute positioning. And then we're going to, actually, we'll do just the opposite. We're actually going to modify this green box. So we're going to move the green box with absolute positioning. So we'll take green box and we'll say position absolute, and we're going to say left 0 and bottom 0. Now 0 means move away from the left edge 0 pixels. Let's actually switch this to right. And move away from the bottom edge 0 pixels. So it's going to use its parent element's position, which is the red box. It does have a position set, so it'll work. And now when we save and refresh, you can see that green box moves down 0 pixels away from the bottom and 0 pixels away from the right. Now, you probably already noticed it, but what happened over here? This blue box moved up where the green box used to be. And that's because of absolute positioning. When we use absolute positioning, we remove the element from the document flow. You can kind of think of this as far as this blue box is concerned, this green box got removed from the document flow, which a way to think of it would be almost to envision that this green box no longer even exists as far as the blue box is concerned. So it would just occupy its natural flow in the document, which is inside of the red box. It would be the first item. Now, obviously, the HTML is in fact there, but that's a kind of a way to think of it when you use absolute positioning, because this green box got removed from flow, and so the blue box thinks it no longer exists. So it would go up and occupy the space where it used to exist. Now, to illustrate again the difference here, I'm going to switch this green box now. Instead of saying position absolute, I'm going to say position relative, and I'll move this box now relatively back down to this green quarter. So if I refresh here, in order to move this green box using relative position, relative is according to itself, so I have to move it from where it naturally occurs over 200 pixels and down 200 pixels. So I would need to say left 200. So let's come back here, we'll say left 200 pixels, and we'll say top 200 pixels to move it down from the top edge, and that should stick it back down in this corner. And it does in fact stay there, but notice now the blue box does not go up and occupy this space, because with relative positioning, the blue box thinks that the red box is still here. That's the way that relative and absolute positioning work and kind of how they differ. So those couple of gotchas between these two types of positioning are often stumbling blocks when people start out writing CSS positioning. And you just really have to understand which items get removed from the document flow and how that will affect all the other items around it. So that's our quick intro into absolute positioning. In the next video tutorial, we're going to be looking at fixed. All right, the last type of CSS positioning is what we call fixed positioning, and we'll quickly look at this one. Fixed positioning is much like absolute positioning. The only difference is that it always uses the browser window for its positioning context. So in this example, we've got, we'll continue off where we left off before. Now I'm going to take this green div, and instead of using relative positioning, I'll move it with fixed. So I'm going to switch this position to fixed. And I'm going to say bottom, let's say 100 pixels, and we'll say right 100 pixels, and save and refresh. Now I would expect this div to actually use the entire browser window. So when I say bottom 200, it's going to move up from the bottom and over from the right. So when I refresh, you can see that in fact positions itself way over here according to the browser window. Now with absolute positioning, it's always according to the browser. So even though the browser window resizes, you can see that that fixed element is always 100 away from the right edge and 100 away from the bottom edge. Even if the page scrolls up and down, as you can see in this instance, that element will always stay visible. You've probably been on websites to where you scroll up and down and a menu item or something like that, or maybe some advertisements over here on the right, they always stay visible whether you are scrolling up or down, and they may be using fixed positioning to do that very thing. So again, that's how fixed positioning works. The only thing I want to point out here is that fixed positioning also removes itself from the document flow. You'll remember that before this blue div was right here, and as soon as I refreshed, that blue div went up to the very top. Because just like absolute positioning, when you use fixed, it's as if the element never existed. So this blue box thinks that it no longer exists, because absolute and Fixed remove from the document flow where Relative does not. In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at z-index. Now, it's easiest just to illustrate z-index, and z-index refers to when two elements overlap, which element is going to be on top of the other element. So I'm going to set up 3 divs here, and they're all going to be inside of my red box. So I'll have green box, blue box, and let's call this one yellow box. And each of these divs will set up to have 100 by 100. So I'm going to delete all this positioning we worked with before and kind of clean this up a little bit. So I have blue box, green box, and we want each one to be 100 by 100. So I'll copy this one more time to create our yellow box. And we'll come over here and save and refresh. Let me actually switch this to yellow really quick. And we'll save and refresh our HTML page here. I've actually closed mine down, so we'll relaunch this HTML file and take a look at how this works. So again, each of these is just regular old divs. They're all child of the red, and this is their natural stacking order. So I'm going to position each of these elements with absolute positioning so that they overlap. So I'll start up here with the top element, which is, so it goes green, blue, yellow, and I'm actually going to rearrange this so this is in the same order as well so I don't get myself confused. So green, blue, then yellow down here. And we will position each of these absolutely. So I'm going to say position, absolute, and I'll say top 50, and I'll say left 50. Need to make sure I do the unit of measure. That's always required unless the value is 0. You always have to have a unit of measure. So if I save and refresh here, this green box I would expect to move down and over 50. Because it got removed from the document flow, both of the other divs moved up where it used to be. So we expect that behavior now. Now let's move the red box right over here so it overlaps. So we'll take the, or not the red box, rather the blue box. I'm just going to copy this position and paste it down here. And I'll move this one 100 pixels instead of 50. And we'll save and refresh. And now you can see the blue box is overlapping this one, and because we used absolute positioning here, the yellow box went up to where it used to be because this is now removed from the document flow and this is removed from the document flow. And lastly, we'll take the yellow box and move it down here as well. So we'll just paste that same rule we have in here, and we'll move this one 150 pixels down, and we'll move this one 150 pixels down, and save and refresh. And now the yellow box is there. So now you can see we have this issue where we have 3 divs, they overlap, and I may want to alter the order in which these things stack. So the default is just the tag that's declared latest in code is on top of the previous tag. So that's kind of the default stacking order. But let's say, what if I want this green box to be in front of the blue box? And in order to do that, we have to use what's called z-index. So I would come up in here to the green box, and the property is z-index, and the value here is not actually a pixel value, it's just a whole number. So I'm just going to say 10 to start things off. So we'll save here and come back and refresh, and now you can see that 10 does in fact, or the green box moves in front of the blue box because it has a higher z-index value than blue. So if I wanted blue to be in front of both of these, it would just have to have a value higher than 10. So if I come to the blue box, then I'll give it a z-index, z-index, and I'll just say 11 here and save and refresh. You can see now blue in fact comes in front of both of these because it has the highest z-index, etc., etc. So z-index is a way you can use to kind of control that 3D or the stacking nature of overlapping elements. And they're always just whole numbers. You can in fact do negative z-indexes to push something behind something else as well. The only thing I would recommend when you're doing z-indexes is don't stack your z-indexes with 10, 11, 12, because then you introduce the problem if what if later on I come in and I need to add another div in between these two, and I have this one as 10 and this one as 11. You cannot do 10.5. It has to be a whole number. So what you would have to do is you would have to then go change everything. I'd have to change this one to 9, and I'd have to change this one to 10, and then add my new one in between, or etc., etc. So when you're doing your z-indexes, I would recommend just building a little bit of a buffer. So start one out at 5, do the next one at 10, do the next one at 15. That way, if you do need to add something in between 5 and 10, you have 5 numbers that you can do that. So you can then alter that later. And that's the basics of z-index. In this video tutorial, we're going to look at a quick sample of CSS positioning. And we're actually going to reference the slide we've seen before and build a simple layout. The layout we're going to be creating is this simple web layout. And this is a common layout on the web. A lot of blog type of sites use this layout. And now that we understand CSS positioning, we have enough skills in order to be able to lay out this particular sample here. So let's jump over to our code and build this layout. We're going to have a header, we're going to have a navigation section, an article or a content section, a sidebar, and a footer. So I'm back here in the HTML and CSS, and I don't have any HTML and I don't have any CSS applied. We'll just build this layout from scratch. So the first thing is to set up our initial blocks that are going to be for our HTML5 tags. Or not our HTML5 tags, our layout rather. And in this particular example, I'm just going to stick with using div tags for now, because we've been using div tags for the last few videos. Once we get into our real world sample, we'll use those HTML5 tags that we learned about in the HTML series. So I'm going to set up several different div tags. So I'm going to call this one div ID equals header, and this will be the div tag for the header. Following the header, I have my navigation div. Following the nav div, I have what I'll just call my content div. Following the content div, I have the sidebar. And following the sidebar, we have our footer. So these are each one of the divs in our HTML page. Now, in order to position all of these elements, I'm going to be using absolute positioning, and they have to have a parent element. So I need to create one more div that's essentially what I call a wrapper tag or a container tag that's a parent to all of these tags. So I'm just going to do another div up here and call it div ID equals, and I'll just call this wrapper. And then all of these tags I'm going to indent over, and then the wrapper will be closed all the way down here. So you can see the wrapper tag is the main parent, and all of these divs inside of here are all children of the wrapper, and they're all siblings to one another. So that's our HTML structure. And let's jump up and start to flesh out some of the wireframe for the CSS. And I'm going to start with the wrapper tag. So I'm going to say pound wrapper. And for the wrapper tag, let's just make this site, we'll kind of make it a little bit smaller because I'm on a lower resolution for this screen recording. So we'll say width equals 800 pixels. And we'll say height equals, height we're going to set to 600 pixels. And let's give this thing a background color of black. Okay, so we'll just do this much. Let's come in here and save and refresh. And I don't get anything, so there must be an error here. Let's make sure. Oh, I see my error. I have not saved my HTML file, so I got to save my HTML and come back and refresh. And there we go. Now I can see that black div has those dimensions, and that's going to be the wrapper. So even though I can't see all of the divs inside of here, they are in fact there. They're in my HTML. So now we need to give each of these divs a little bit of dimension so we can see them. So let's start off and we'll say pound header. That's the next div. And I'm going to copy all of this HTML because we're going to be repeating this quite a bit. And this div is going to have a width of 800, maybe a height of only 100 pixels. And let's just make it red. And we'll save and refresh. And there's my header div. So the next div is below this will be the navigation div. So I'm going to copy all of this header code and come down here and we'll say width 800, and maybe our navigation is only 50 pixels tall. And we'll make this one yellow and save and refresh. And I actually forgot to rename it, so I need to name this one nav, which I believe is the ID name I gave this one. Yep, div ID equals nav. Double check that. Save and refresh. So here we have the header div and the nav div. And the next div over here is going to be our content div. So it's the next div in the HTML down here, content. So we'll do it next. I'll just do the same thing. I'll just paste here and switch this to content. For the content div, let's make it 600 pixels wide, and we'll make it maybe, let's see, 400 pixels tall, and let's make it green. And let's save and come back here and refresh. And there's our content div. That's looking pretty good there. And then the next div we need is the sidebar div, and it needs to go over here. So we'll kind of scroll down here a little bit, and I'll paste again. And this one's going to be sidebar. And it's going to have a width of 200 because 200 plus 600 equals the overall width of 800. So it has to be small enough to fit up inside of this area. So 200, the height will be the same as the content, so it's going to be 400 tall. And we'll make this guy purple. And we'll save and refresh. Now here's where we run into our first issue. Because this is just the natural flow, div tags are block level elements, so they all occupy their own space. So this green div occupies this line, and this sidebar occupies this line. So now we run into where we need to use CSS positioning to alter the natural flow of this particular element and move it up into this slot right here. So what we're going to do on this particular div is we're going to say position absolute. And if it's absolutely positioned, remember that's positioned according to the parent element, but only if the parent element has a position itself. Right now, if I look at my CSS, my wrapper does not have a position. So I need to remember to give this wrapper a position, and I'll just assign that relative, as we learned before, in order for this absolute positioning to work. So now that I've assigned that, let's look here and figure out how exactly we need to move this div. So the wrapper tag is this big black one. It goes all the way up and over here. So it needs to come down the height of the header plus the height of the nav. That's how far down from the top it needs to come. So our header div up here is 100 pixels and our nav is 50. So this thing needs to come down top 150 pixels. So we'll do that, save and refresh. And that in fact moves it down. And now it needs to come clear over here. Now that's right on the right edge. So I can simply just say right 0 and save and refresh. And that tacks that div exactly up into place. So now that one's positioned correctly. Let's come back over here and do our last div, which is our footer. So I'll paste here, which I have in my clipboard, and call this one footer. And height is going to be 50 here. And the width will be the full width. And let's say background color equals orange. And we'll save that and refresh. And that footer div naturally falls right here. The reason why it falls right here is because the purple div used to be here. But since I used absolute positioning, the purple div got removed from the document flow. So this orange div occupied its previous spot, which is naturally after the green div. Again, you can kind of think of this if we look at our code. Because I absolutely positioned the sidebar, it's as if it didn't exist or doesn't exist rather. And so the footer would naturally follow the content, which is there's the content and there's the footer. So that's why that footer div is right there. I'll undo that change because we know it in fact does exist. Just that other div thinks it doesn't. So that's the basics of this CSS layout. So we have our header, our content, we have our navigation, content, sidebar, and footer. The last thing we're going to do here is center this entire page. And this is a little bit of a CSS trick to center elements. So I can take this wrapper div, and by assigning it this code, margin : 0 space auto, and saving and refreshing, that automatically centers the div within the available space. And the handy thing about this is if I resize the browser window, you can see that it always stays in the center of the browser no matter what. And if they go smaller than the width, then you just get the scroll bars, which you'd scroll left and right. And that's how I would say almost half of the websites on the internet use this trick to center themselves inside of the browser window, because when you're designing, you really never know exactly how wide the screen resolution of the particular person using your website. So this is an easy way to make sure that your site always stays in the middle of their window regardless of the size. The reason why this works, the first value here, again, this is CSS shorthand that we learned earlier in this series. The first value refers to the top and bottom margins. So I'm setting top margin to 0, bottom margin to 0. The second value refers to the left and right margins. So here we have left auto and right auto. Now auto basically makes the margins the same. So it tries to make the left margin the same as the right margin. And if you think about that, if the margins are the exact same on the left and the right, then the content has to be in the middle because these two have to equal. And if you resize the browser, if these are always equaling one another, it's always going to center the content. So that's kind of maybe the way you can think of that little trick, but this margin 0 auto will center objects in the browser window. Now this only works if they have a width declared. If I didn't have a width, the default width is 100%, and you can't center something that's already 100% width. So you have to have a width that's smaller than the available space, and then it will center itself automatically. In this series of tutorials, we're going to be looking at CSS Floats. We'll quickly introduce them in this intro video and look at a couple of the common use cases for floating. Now, CSS Floats have a few properties we want to understand before we dive into the code. When you float a CSS object, you can either float it left or right. Once you've floated a CSS object, you have to clear the float in order to restore the normal document flow. And you can either clear left, right, or both referring to left and right objects. A few important notes about CSS floating is when you float elements, they get removed from the document flow, much like absolute and fixed positioning. And CSS Floats is an alternative to CSS positioning for laying out pages. One important thing to note is inline elements like text or paragraphs wrap around a floated element, and floated elements hover on top of other HTML elements, hence the term float. So those are a few of the basic properties of floats, and let's look at a couple of use cases. So typically floats are used to wrap text around an element. Like in this case here, we have an image tag here, and if I want a paragraph of text to wrap around it, I would use CSS Floats. The other main CSS Float use is to create multi-column layouts. So a header, sidebar, content, footer, etc. Just like we did with CSS Positioning, CSS Floats can be used to create these multi-column layouts. As floats can be often confusing at first, we'll start out with looking at a simple example of this wraparound floated element. Then the following video tutorials will cover how to create multi-column layouts using floats and talk a little bit about the plus and minus of the different methods. So let's jump over here to our web browser and, or rather our code editor, and we're going to create a simple example of the floated element. So in order to do this, we'll just set up a basic div tag, and inside of this div, we're going to load an image and a paragraph of text. So let's go ahead and open the image. We'll say image source equals, and this image is under the resources folder, images flower.jpg, I believe is what it's called, and we'll say alt equals flower. And that image again is located, if we go back here, it's under my, I'm currently working on this file, so I go into the resources folder, into the images, and there it is, flower.jpg. So hence that relative file path. Now let's save this and jump over to our browser and refresh to make sure we got that image loaded. And in fact we do. Now this image is quite large, so I'm actually going to set a width and a height on this. Again, as we covered in our previous tutorials, you wouldn't want to do this in a production site, but just to illustrate this, I'll set this equal to 30% and save and refresh. Whoops, I must have done something wrong there. We want, let's say width equals 30%, and we'll say height. That's actually correct. It's 30% of the document width, so once we set this wrapper tag up, this div tag will adjust this value. So let's come over to our CSS and get this div tag set up so we can see it. We'll just do a simple tag-based selector, and we'll just say div, or rather, let's set up the background color. So we'll say background color is, well, let's just make this orange, something a little lighter. And we'll set the width to 500 pixels, and we'll set the height equal to 500 pixels. And let's save and refresh here. So now we can see that width's coming into play. And then we're going to create our paragraph of text and wrap it all the way around here. So let's jump back over to our CSS and let's get a paragraph inside of here. And we'll say this is a bunch of text And we're just going to copy this and paste it quite a few times in here just to get a sample paragraph. And then we'll close that paragraph tag and save and come back to our web browser. Okay, so now we're looking good. So we have this image and we have some text that's inside of this little div tag. So we're going to use a simple CSS float to wrap this text around the image. Now what we can do is we can take this image, and if we come into our CSS, I'll say img, we're just going to use simple tag-based selectors here. And I'm going to say float : left. Remember, left is one of the options. It's either going to be left or right. So I'll just save this. And when I refresh here, you can see the image is now floated left. It gets removed from the document flow. But one of the natures of floating is when you float, type wraps around a floated element. So that's why the text is wrapping around this when this is floated left. And if I was to take this option and float it right, you'll be able to see here, just the opposite happens. I can float this to the right side. Now this text, we actually don't want to bump all the way up against this. So let's put this back to the left. So what we could do is we could add some padding on this image. So I maybe want to say padding is 15 pixels. And let's save and refresh. And you can see that adds that little bit of a cushion, right? So that that text doesn't run all the way up against my image. And that's a simple example of floats and how it's used to wrap text around an image. In the next tutorials, we're going to look at the much more complex examples of creating page layouts with floated elements. The last major topic in this CSS series is CSS Floats. And CSS Floats is the alternative to CSS Positioning for altering the document flow. And CSS Floats has some positives and negatives, just like CSS Positioning has some trade-offs. And we're going to look at floats in this couple of video tutorials here. Floats are probably the more difficult of the two for beginners to understand, but they're probably the preferred method of laying out things on the web. Now, in order to illustrate CSS floats, I'm going to build a little bit of a boilerplate here. I'm just starting from a blank slate. And I'm going to create a div tag, and we'll say ID equals wrapper. So we'll create this wrapper tag here, and inside of this we'll just create two divs. So this one's going to be ID equals red, and the latter div here will be blue. So we have just a basic layout here. We have a wrapper or a parent tag with two children. And let's set up some basic CSS. So on this wrapper tag, we'll just say background-color is black. And on these other two tags, we'll just give those each a separate dimension as well. So on this red one, we'll make it red. On the blue one, we'll make it blue. And we're going to give each of these tags a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. And then once we have this little boilerplate code set up here, we'll save and jump back to our browser and refresh. And you can see this is how it's looking. So I have my red div, my blue div, and that wrapper tag is around them both. Now, when you use CSS floats, it's oftentimes you're trying to build a column-based layout where there's 2 columns or 3 columns or things that are side by side. And there's quite a few use cases for CSS floats. Now, when using CSS floats, there are a few options. So the first option is you have to declare a float. So I'm going to come up here to the red div and I'm going to say float. And your options are either left or right. So whenever you float, you're either going to float left or right. That's the only 2 options. There's no such thing as float center. It's either the left or the right. And when you do a CSS float, it automatically removes the element from document flow. So just like when you use absolute positioning, by floating an element, it removes itself from the document flow. So I'm going to take this red div and float it to the right. So I'll save here and come back, and when I refresh, you can see that red div goes all the way to the right of whatever its parent container is, and it sticks itself on the right hand side. And that's the basics of how this float works. So now I'm going to actually take this, let me back up a little bit. Now, because this red div is floated right, it's removed from the document flow. So as far as the HTML is concerned, let's go back here and look at our HTML. We can think of this as being completely gone. So the wrapper div thinks that it only has a blue div inside of it. So keep that in mind when we do this next little piece. So now I'm going to take this blue div and I'm going to float it to the left. So I'll say float left. And let's save here and we'll come back and refresh. So the blue div is now floated left, the red div is now floated right, and notice that my wrapper completely disappeared. And the reason is because when you float, it's removed from the document flow. So you can think that both of these divs are gone. So now my wrapper div, which is that black div, thinks that there's nothing inside of it. So it's invisible because there's no height or width now to that div because both of the children were floated. They got removed from the document flow. So it thinks that it's empty. Thus, there's nothing displayed here. So when you remove or when you float, elements get removed from the document flow. So the question is, well, they are in fact there. So how do I get that red or the wrapper div, that black div, to go back around both of these divs? And that idea is what we call clear fix. Whenever you float, you have to do a clear fix to the element so that the wrapper tag will wrap around the elements. Now, a clear fix is a little bit complicated, especially for this intro series. And what I recommend you do is just go Google for what's called the clear fix. And if we Google for clear fix, there's several links here that talk about clear fixes. And we'll just go to the CSS tricks. Nicholas Gallagher here has quite a few different clear fixes that he's written over the years. But let's just quickly apply one so you can see what it does. So I'm going to come down here and I'm just going to copy all of this code right here from Chris Coyer's website. And we'll jump back here and apply this fix. So I'm going to come to my CSS and paste all of that code inside of there. You don't have to really worry about any of this stuff. Most of this stuff is just little CSS hacks and whatnot to make this work in all the different browsers and Internet Explorer and Chrome and Safari and all the different variants of the browsers. All we really need to do is get this code in here. Notice that all this code is set up on a class called .clearfix. So once you have floated an element, if you want the parent element to contain the children or to reappear, all you have to do is just apply that class. So I say class equals clearfix. So I'm setting this class, which is going to apply all of the CSS we pasted inside of here. And notice once I save, I'll save my HTML and save my CSS. Come back here and let's refresh this. I can close this down now and refresh. And now my wrapper div reappears where it should be. So essentially what a clearfix does is it restores the normal document flow to a parent tag whose children have been floated. So that's one way to make a parent contain the children. There's another way. If I didn't apply this clearfix, so I'm going to delete all this code and let's assume that I didn't use that method. So I'll save here again and come back and refresh and notice they're gone. If you float the children and you want the parent element to contain the children, you can also float the parent. So I can come up here to the wrapper tag and I can say float left here, and that will in fact, whoops, I did that to the wrong one there. So I didn't do it to the wrong one, it's just the problem is I can't see it. So I need to actually give this thing some margin. So I'll say margin 10 pixels and save and refresh. And not margin, padding. So let's save and refresh. And you can actually see that that black box is in fact containing the children. If I was to take that float out and refresh, you can see now it no longer contains the children, it just has that 15 pixels of padding. Now the reason why all compacts down is whenever you float, so whenever I say float left, whenever I float left or right, it automatically shrinks the tag to only its needed space. So in other words, this tag compacts down and now the width of the wrapper is only the width of its needed space, which happens to be the left and the right element. So that's how you can kind of think of floats. Whenever you float an element, it shrinks down to only the space it absolutely needs. So by floating the parent, I can clear the float, or by floating, or by applying that clear fix hack. Some people call it the CSS clear fix hack. I can also clear a float. So those are a couple of ways. In the next tutorial, we'll look at a few of the other nuances of clearing or floating and clearing floats. All right, in this second series, in the floating, we're going to look at an alternate method for clearing and floating. So let's jump back here to our code we've been working on, and we'll set this up a little bit different this time. So we've still got our red div, and we still have our blue div, and we're going to come in here and delete these floats. So we'll delete all of these floats. So just recapping our previous two methods, the first method was applying the clear fix hack. The second method was to float the parent, and we're going to look at the third method for making a parent element contain the children when the children are floated. So again, this is just back to default, so let's come back here and save and refresh. So I have my wrapper tag and I have the two child tags. We have no floating or any fancy CSS positioning applied. This is just the natural document flow here. And we're going to now float each of these elements again. So this time I'm going to say float left on the red tag and also float left on the blue tag to illustrate what happens if you float two items left. So I'm going to refresh, and you'll notice when I float left on both of them, they just stack next to one another. And they will stack next to one another as long as there's available space. So as long as my wrapper tag has enough room, these will just keep stacking one onto the other if you keep floating them left. But as soon as there's no more space, so if I resize my browser window below the point, and in fact my browser window actually won't let me resize past this point, so I've actually got to make these a little bit wider to illustrate this. So I'm going to come in here and I'll make the width on each of these 300 and 300, and then I'll save and refresh here. So let me refresh. So you can see there's still enough space, but as soon as my browser window gets below that amount of space, it jumps below it. So when you float two items left, they'll stack in a line, in a horizontal line, if there's enough space for them to stack. Once you get below that space, they just jump down below. So that's kind of what happens when you float two items left. Now, we still have the issue that the parent element is not containing the children, because these are removed from the document flow when you float. So the third method is by using the property clear on the HTML. And in order to do this, I have to actually introduce one more tag. And I'm just going to use a break tag in this instance. So this is kind of maybe an older method of clearing the floats. I think kind of a new and improved method is the clear fix hack. However, this is kind of an older method, but it still works just fine. I'm going to add a break tag, and I'm going to say style equals clear. Or not style, whoops, I want to say class equals clear. And then I'm going to come up here and say dot clear. So I'm adding this class definition, and I'm going to say clear both. Now, when you're clearing is used to clear the float. The options are left to clear left floated elements, and it's right to clear right floated elements, and it's both to clear both left and right floated elements. Typically, you'll just use both, but occasionally you'll need to use one or the other. Now, once I set this to clear both, I'm going to jump back here and refresh, and now you can see, in fact, that parent does, in fact, contain the children, and it stays this time at 100% wide. So this is kind of like the clear fix hack method. Now, the reason this works is a little bit difficult to understand, but you can kind of think of it like this. When I say class equals clear, or when I assign this break tag and I make it clear both, what I'm saying is the break has to visually appear after these floated elements. In other words, it has to visually clear the two floated elements. So if this is floated left and this is floated left, and after that there's a break tag, and it has to clear both of them, it can't appear till down here. And then once this appears down here, the wrapper tag says, oh, the break tag's down here, so I now have a child and it's down here, so I need to go all the way around that tag. Now I know that's a little bit difficult to understand, especially visually here through the video presentation. But maybe an easier way would be to, instead of doing a break tag, let's make this a div tag. And let's make this div tag that's cleared. Let's give it a height and a width and a background color as well. So we'll say background color is, let's see, what have we not used? Purple. And we'll just say width is maybe 100 and height is 100. And save and refresh. So now you can see that this has some dimension to it. So again, this purple tag is being cleared. So I'm clearing the left and the right floats, which means it has to appear after the cleared elements. And because it has to appear after the cleared elements, the big giant wrapper tag says, oh, I now have a tag here. These are still removed from the document flow, but now this tag, you can kind of think of it as restoring document flow. So this tag restored document flow. So now the wrapper tag finally wraps around both of the floated elements, and then everything from here on out will be in normal document flow, assuming I do not alter those elements with left and right floats. If later on down here I had more divs and I made one left and made one right with floats, I would have to clear those floats as well to restore the normal document flow. Otherwise, everything would start to overlap and my layout would break. So that's a quick introduction of floats. In the next video tutorial, we're going to build the same layout we did with CSS positioning, only this time we'll use floats to pull it off. All right, in this final floating video, we're going to look at a simple example. We're going to replicate that same layout we did with CSS positioning, only this time we'll use floats. So I'm going to jump over here to my code, and I have the exact same HTML we worked on before. So I'm not going to retype all of this. You might want to pause the video and catch up with me right here, but this is all the HTML code you need, which is the exact same as the CSS positioning code. The only difference is going to be the HTML, or rather the CSS. So let's jump over to the CSS and we'll do this part from scratch. So I'm going to create my wrapper tag again. And this is going to have a width of 800 pixels. And this is going to have a height of, let's see, I think we said 600 pixels and a background color of black. If you have all the code from the CSS positioning one, you can go ahead and just copy and paste that, as well as we're just going to make a few changes. But I'm going to do this rather quickly, so I'm going to just paste this out several times and then change all the values. So I'll do that's for my header, my nav, my content, sidebar, and footer. And I'll come and change each of these. So it's going to be the header. It's going to have the same width. It's going to have a height of 100. We'll make it red. The nav has the same width, height of 50, and we'll make it blue. The content is going to have a width of, we did 600 pixels before, and it had a height of 400. And we'll say green. And the sidebar has a height of 200, same height of, or rather a width of 200, height of 400. Make this one orange. And our footer had a width of 800 and a height of 50, and a background color of, let's see, which color have we not used? It's purple. And let's save and refresh and make sure we're good to go here. So let's open up that HTML page in our web browser and make sure this is all lined up. So we have our header, our nav, we have the content, we have the sidebar, and we have the footer. So this is just the default layout, which is the same thing we did before. Now we have the same issue. We need to get this sidebar, and we need to get the sidebar up in this area. So now this time we're going to be using CSS floats. So the first thing is to take this sidebar and float it right. So we'll come to our sidebar and we'll say float right and save. Come up in here and refresh, and now it's floated to the right. But the problem is it's at the right edge, but it's still not fitting up into this slot. And the reason is because this tag right here, which is our content div, it's a block level tag, meaning it's occupying this entire horizontal area. So this tag can't go up in here. So what we need to do is we need to take this tag and float it left, and then this will slide up in there because they'll both be removed from the document flow. So our content area, we're going to say float left and save and refresh. And now that tag's floated left, that tag is floated right, and they're both removed from the document flow. So you ask yourself, well, where did the footer tag go? The footer used to be down here. Because both of these are floated, the footer tag slid up, and it's actually underneath them. It's actually right inside of here. We could see it if we just added a little bit of padding to this tag right here. Let's just add 10 pixels and refresh. You can see the footer is in fact up underneath both of those because these two were removed from the document flow. So let's undo that. So now the problem is I need to restore document flow on the footer tag. So this is where we can apply that clearing. So down here on the footer, I can say clear, and because I have both a left and a right floated element, I need to say both. And again, restating what we've gone over, because I clear, that means that that footer has to appear after these two elements visually, whatever they are. So now when I refresh, that footer tag does in fact jump back down here, so the footer is now in its proper position. And then to finish this off, we can do the same thing we did before. If we come up to our wrapper, we can say margin 0 space auto. That will center it, and we're off to the races. This will remain in the center. So you can see that with floating, I simply had to add a float here and a float here. So it's, as far as the code, it's about 6's. CSS positioning was about the same amount of code. We just had to simply add a CSS positioning in the previous rule. I prefer using floating. There's a few trade-offs between floating and CSS positioning that I'll quickly cover. By using floats, the content of both of these areas will continue to stretch if the content grows. Let me illustrate this. Now, if I take off the height on the sidebar and I take off the height on the content, they're just going to collapse because they don't have any content. But the benefit of using floats is if I add a whole bunch of content inside of here, here's a bunch of stuff, and I'll just do a break tag. And I'm just going to copy and paste this a whole bunch of times inside of this paragraph tag. So here's my paragraphs, and I'll just copy and paste away here a whole bunch of times to illustrate this. Then I'll come and refresh. You can see that as long as that code, or as long as the content keeps growing, so if I add more and more and more and save and refresh, the div just keeps on stretching down and down, and the footer will always be below the content. And this is how a lot of blog sites are laid out, because you really don't know how much content will be on the home page. They could have 1 post, they could have 6 posts. So no matter how long the content is, the footer will always remain on the bottom, and it'll just keep stretching out forever and ever and ever and ever, which is really nice because then your footer is always at the bottom of your website. With the CSS positioning method, this doesn't quite work out as nice, and I'll illustrate that next. So I'm going to leave all this content here, except I'm going to come back to my styles. I'm going to delete these floats, and I'll put back in the height here. So I'll say height is 400 pixels, and right here I'll say height is 400 pixels. And let's delete this clear. So now I'm going to basically do it the same way we did before, where I'll use positioning. So I've got to set up my wrapper. I'll say position is relative, and then I'll come down here to the sidebar, and I'll say position absolute, and we'll say right 0, top 150. Save and refresh. So that sticks this element over here. I'm getting actually these black spaces up here because this paragraph actually has a default margin. So I'm actually just going to delete those paragraph tags to hurry and get rid of that. So you can see the issue here that if you have more content, it just overlaps. So to mitigate this issue, I would have to come inside of here and delete the height. So if you have an explicit height set in your CSS like we do on our content section, it'll always be that height. And so if I delete the height and save and refresh, then you can see that the tag, or the div rather, does in fact stretch according to the content, which is working fairly nice in this instance. Now the reason why it's working here is because this tag is not positioned, the content area. To illustrate this, what I have to do is I have to take all this content and move it over and stick it inside of the sidebar. So I just cut and pasted it inside of the sidebar. We'll come up in here and refresh. And let's go back here, and we'll take off the height on our sidebar div. So we'll do the same thing. We'll just replace this so it doesn't look funny. and come back and refresh. Now you can see that the sidebar has all sort of content, and it keeps stretching. As long as I keep adding more and more break tags in there, that content would just keep stretching along. So we can add a whole nother set and refresh, and it just keeps growing. But the problem is the footer. Because this element is floated, the footer is still stuck right there. And so it doesn't, we want the footer to appear after here, down always on the bottom of the site. But if you use CSS positioning, you can't get the footer to go all the way down there. In order to get the footer down there, you would have to reposition the footer all the way to the bottom. So that's a quick overview of floats, and maybe one or two of the benefits of using floats instead of using CSS positioning. Now the last thing I want to illustrate here is I'm going to cut out all of this content here from this sidebar div. So we'll cut that out. I'm going to paste it back up into the content div and refresh. And you'll notice that because I have a height set on my content div, content has height of 400. So no matter what, this div is going to be 400 pixels tall. Even though there's a whole bunch more content, it just kind of overflows and it's just kind of messy and it breaks your layout. So if you have an explicit height set on a div, but the content is too large, there's a few options. The default behavior is just that it overflows and kind of runs on top of all the elements. But you can set a few of the properties on that div to determine how that content will flow in the box. So what you can do is the property here is called overflow, and I can set this to hidden. If I save and refresh, any of the content that's outside of this 400 pixels height just gets cut off. So it's still there, it's just invisible really now. It just cuts it off there and I can't see it. Or you can set this to auto. And what auto does is if the content of the content div is taller than 400 pixels, which we know it is, it'll automatically add a scroll bar here to the side. And that allows the user to scroll up and down between your content, but only in this particular div. So that's one way that you can have a whole bunch of content in a simple area with a fixed height. Just set that overflow to auto, and then you'll get those scroll bars. So again, the default is just, it keeps on going forever, or you can make it hidden, or you can say overflow auto to get these scroll bars on the left and right.
All right, if you've made it to the end of the video, congratulations. You can see that we leave off with kind of all the basics covered, but there's still quite a bit to be desired. So if you're curious on how to push your CSS knowledge a little bit further, I have several videos. Specifically, one important video that you'll want to take a look at is on the CSS grid, which is a new layout method in CSS that's getting really popular in the last couple of years. So check out my CSS grid video, and that will teach you a whole new set of tips and tricks where you can take your CSS to the next level. So please like, subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.